A suspect in a 1964 cold case murder in Elmira has finally been named, and the case is now closed. Law enforcement naming the killer after 6 decades of investigation. WENY's Lindsay Madison tells us how they finally solved the murder of Mary Theresa Simpson. Lindsay.
Renata, officials say the suspect was 32 years old at the time when he sexually assaulted and murdered Mary Theresa Simpson. New information coming to light this afternoon that the suspect lived in Elmira the entire time, and it was thanks to familial DNA that he was identified.
I was 16 when it happened, and it affected me real bad. I wanted to jump in the casket. My dad had to pull me back.
The woods along Combs Hill Road sat quiet on the morning of March 19, 1964. A man walked ahead of his 2 sons, boots pressing into wet ground, still soft from winter. He was not looking for anything. He was simply walking, the way people do when the weather finally breaks. Then his foot caught on something beneath a pile of stones and broken branches, something that did not belong there. He knelt down. He moved the dirt aside with his hands. What he found stopped him where he stood. For 4 days, a family in Elmira, New York, had been living inside a silence no parent should know. A 12-year-old girl walked out of her father's apartment on a Sunday afternoon and simply did not come home. Not that night, not the next morning, not for 4 days. Now, in these woods, 5 miles from where she was last seen alive, that silence was about to end. But the answer would not come for another 62 years. Today, we're looking at the murder of Mary Theresa Simpson. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let us get into it. Mary Theresa Simpson was 12 years old, and like most 12-year-old girls in 1964, her world was small and familiar. Elmira, New York was not a large city, but it was hers. She knew its streets the way children know a place they have never had reason to leave. She knew which corners belonged to which relatives, which houses held her cousins, which sidewalks led home without her having to think about it. She was born in the early 1950s, the exact date lost somewhere in the gaps of old paperwork, the kind of small uncertainty that tends to happen to ordinary families who never expected their lives to become a matter of public record. She was the daughter of Ellsworth and Rose Simpson. She had an older brother, an older sister, and an older half-brother, which meant she grew up somewhere in the middle of a family, never quite the oldest, never quite the baby, learning early how to move between people. Her parents separated in May of 1963, less than a year before everything changed. It was the kind of quiet family shift that reshapes a child's daily life without ever making the news. She went to live with her father. For a while, that meant leaving Elmira altogether, moving with him to Hammondsport while he searched for steady work. Then, in early March of 1964, just weeks before her disappearance, he found that work back in Elmira, and they returned. She was, in a very real sense, still settling back into a place she had once called home, still relearning its rhythms, still reconnecting with cousins and a grandfather she had been away from. Her father took an apartment on North Main Street. Her mother, meanwhile, lived separately, on DeWitt Avenue, the 2 households now existing on different streets in the same small city, the way families sometimes do after a separation, close enough to see each other, far enough to require a choice. On the afternoon of March 15, 1964, a Sunday, Mary Theresa left her father's apartment sometime around 3 o'clock. She told him she was going to visit a cousin. It was an ordinary thing to say, the kind of sentence a parent hears 100 times without a second thought. There was no reason for him to question it. But that is not quite where she went, not at first. Before she reached her cousin, she walked to her mother's house on DeWitt Avenue and stayed there for about an hour. It was a small deception, if it was even a deception at all. Perhaps she simply wanted to see her mother without making a production of it. It is the kind of quiet, private choice children make constantly, one that would have meant nothing at all were it not for what came after. From her mother's house, she walked on to her grandfather's house on Sierra Street. There, she found her cousins, and for a while, the afternoon was exactly what it looked like from the outside. A 12-year-old girl playing with family on a Sunday. The last hours of an ordinary weekend, unremarkable, unhurried, The kind of afternoon nobody thinks to memorize because nobody yet has reason to. Around 6:30 that evening, she said her goodbyes and started walking home. She was seen at the corner of East Market and Harriet Streets, moving in the direction of her father's apartment. This is the last confirmed sighting of Mary Theresa Simpson by someone who knew her well enough for investigators to trust the timeline. But it was not, in fact, the very last time she was seen. Around 7 o'clock, a friend spotted her standing in front of a store. They spoke, briefly. She told her friend she was heading home. It was a small, forgettable exchange, the kind of thing you would never remember clearly if someone did not later ask you to. Then Mary Theresa continued on, alone, into the evening. She never arrived. Her father waited. An hour passed, then 2. The kind of ordinary lateness a parent forgives without alarm slowly began to curdle into something else. Sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night, Ellsworth Simpson could no longer explain away her absence. He contacted the Elmira police. His daughter had not come home. What followed in the hours after that call was not a slow bureaucratic process. It was urgent from the start. A missing 12-year-old, gone past dark, unaccounted for by every relative and friend who might have known where she was, is the kind of report that moves a small department quickly. Officers began working outward from the last confirmed sighting at East Market and Harriet, retracing her known route hour by hour, speaking to the friend who had seen her outside the store, speaking again to the family members she had visited that afternoon, trying to establish exactly when the ordinary Sunday had turned into something else. At first, detectives worked through the most obvious explanations. A girl her age sometimes stays too long at a relative's house, loses track of time, or takes a detour with a friend before heading home. Officers checked every address connected to the family that night, in case she had simply gone somewhere no one had thought to mention. By the following morning, that theory had run out. Every relative, every friend, every place a 12-year-old might reasonably go had already been checked, and none of them had seen her since that brief exchange outside the store. With the simple explanations exhausted, the search widened into something more deliberate. Officers checked vacant buildings, abandoned homes, junkyards, excavation sites, and used car lots. The kind of overlooked spaces a search team covers when they are no longer hoping for a simple explanation. Foul play became a working concern almost immediately, not because of any single piece of evidence, but because of the shape of her disappearance itself. A 12-year-old who knew her neighborhood well, who had successfully navigated the same walk home countless times, did not simply vanish between one familiar corner and the next without something intervening. Investigators pressed her family and neighbors for anything unusual in the weeks before, any stranger who had been noticed on her route, any car that had seemed out of place. Detectives also worked through anyone in the area with a known history that might connect them to a crime like this, cross-checking names against local police records in a process that, in 1964, meant paging through paper files rather than searching a database. What they got back, from every direction, was largely silence. No one reported seeing her after that brief exchange outside the store. No one came forward with a sighting further along her path home. Detectives worked outward in expanding circles, canvassing homes near East Market and Harriet, then further along her likely path, hoping someone had glanced out a window at the right moment. Nobody had, or if they had, nobody remembered it clearly enough to be useful. The case had, within days, produced almost nothing for detectives to chase beyond the last known moment of her walk, and that silence held for 4 more days while the search continued without a single solid lead to follow. On March 19th, that silence ended. In a wooded area off Combs Hill Road in Southport, roughly 5 miles from where Mary Theresa had last been seen walking home, a man hiking with his 2 sons made a discovery that would define the next 62 years of this case. Her body had been hidden beneath a covering of stones, dirt, and broken branches, concealed with enough deliberate effort that it was not the kind of thing a person stumbles across easily. It took someone walking directly through that patch of woods, on an ordinary morning, for her to be found at all. She was fully clothed. She had been sexually assaulted. The cause of death was ultimately established as strangulation. Word of the discovery spread through Elmira quickly. Searching for a missing child carries one kind of fear, confirming that child has been murdered carries another. It changed the character of the investigation overnight. What had been, for 4 days, a search for a lost girl was now, unmistakably, a hunt for whoever had killed her, and it drew resources and attention accordingly. What investigators could do with that scene in 1964 was limited in ways that are difficult to appreciate now. There was no way to lift a usable genetic profile from anything at the site. Fingerprint evidence depended entirely on surfaces smooth enough and protected enough to hold a print, and a wooded hillside exposed to 4 days of March weather offered almost none. What detectives could do, they did methodically. They photographed the scene before anything was disturbed. They documented the position of the stones and branches covering her, evidence that whoever left her there had taken the time to conceal what he had done rather than simply flee. They searched the surrounding ground for anything left behind, a footprint, a discarded object, any sign of a struggle that might mark the actual location where the attack itself had occurred, as opposed to where her body was later found. They collected what physical evidence existed and interviewed anyone known to frequent that stretch of woods. Hunters, hikers, anyone with a reason to have been there in the days before the discovery. What none of that work could do was point toward a specific person. Every photograph, every measurement, every item collected from that hillside was preserved and filed away with the case, standard practice even when investigators had no immediate use for it. It was, in effect, a bet that future science might one day make sense of evidence the present could not. The scene told investigators how she died and gave them a rough sense of when. It could not tell them who was responsible, and without that answer, every other piece of careful documentation from that morning would sit unused for decades. For 1964, the investigation was exhaustive. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews over the following months and years, chasing leads that dead-ended, questioning anyone who might have crossed paths with her on that Sunday evening. Names surfaced and were cleared. Tips came in and led nowhere. But without forensic evidence capable of naming a suspect, the case depended entirely on someone eventually saying the right thing to the right investigator, or on a suspect's name surfacing through some unrelated crime. Neither happened. One by one, the leads dried up. The interviews grew further apart. The case did what so many cases from that era eventually did. It settled into the quiet, permanent category of unsolved. Mary Theresa Simpson was buried at St. Peter and Paul's Cemetery in Elmira. Her family carried on, the way families are forced to, without the one thing that might have offered them something close to peace. An answer. What none of them could have known was that the evidence capable of finally providing one was already sitting in that case file, waiting not for a witness or a confession, but for a kind of science that had not been invented yet. Then, in 2022, something shifted. Not a new witness, not a deathbed confession. A grant, awarded through an organization called Season of Justice, made it possible for investigators to apply investigative genetic genealogy to evidence that had been sitting in storage since 1964. Preserved on her clothing was DNA that investigators in the 1960s could never have tested, never have understood, never have imagined would one day speak on her behalf. In February of 2023, that evidence was sent to a laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, operated by a forensic genealogy company called Othram. Working alongside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's own forensic genetic genealogy team, analysts developed a usable DNA profile from the decades-old evidence and began tracing it through public genealogical records, comparing it against distant relatives and shared ancestors to build outward toward a family line. Through 2024 and into 2025, that work steadily narrowed. It did not hand investigators a name outright. It handed them, step by step, a smaller and smaller pool of possibilities. Each new match to a distant relative eliminated whole branches of a family tree and strengthened the ones that remained, until the genealogical trail pointed to one specific family connected to Elmira, the same city where Mary Theresa had spent her entire short life. That narrowing turned a lead into a name. Genetic genealogy could show investigators which family the evidence most likely belonged to. It could not, on its own, confirm which individual within that family was responsible. And within that family were multiple men across 2 generations who could theoretically have been the source. each one requiring its own careful elimination before investigators could move forward with confidence. To close that gap, investigators needed a direct comparison, and the most practical path to one ran through the living. They identified a man believed to be the biological son of whoever had left DNA on Mary Theresa's clothing in 1964. Testing his DNA was the fastest way to confirm or eliminate that entire branch of the family without yet having to seek an exhumation, a step no one takes lightly. He agreed to provide a voluntary sample. It was tested by the New York State Police Forensic Investigation Center, and the results narrowed the field decisively, pointing toward one specific individual within that family line, a man who had died decades earlier and who had never, in 61 years, appeared as a suspect in Mary Theresa's case. A familial match was strong evidence, but it was not yet final proof. A son's DNA could confirm a family line. It could not, on its own, confirm which member of that family had left the evidence in 1964. To answer that question directly, investigators needed to compare the man's own DNA against the evidence itself. That meant exhumation, a decision investigators do not make on a hunch. It requires legal authorization, coordination with a family that may have no idea their relative is under suspicion, and confidence that the genealogical work has already narrowed the field enough to justify disturbing a grave. By November of 2025, investigators had that confidence. With financial assistance from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, Elmira Police, and the Chemung County District Attorney's Office made the decision to exhume his grave. A forensic anthropologist traveled from Detroit to assist with the recovery and comparison of remains. The DNA extracted from that exhumation was compared directly against the DNA preserved on Mary Theresa's clothing since 1964. The result left almost no room for doubt. The odds that it belonged to anyone other than the exhumed individual were calculated at less than 1 in 320 billion. The man identified was Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr., born in 1931, an Elmira resident who had died in 2004. He had no known connection to Mary Theresa or her family, and yet buried within his own history was a documented pattern of offenses involving children, a pattern that existed quietly for decades without ever being connected to the girl found off Combs Hill Road. He had never been questioned in 1964. His name appeared nowhere in the original case file. For 61 years, he lived and later remained buried, entirely outside the scope of an investigation that had, without anyone realizing it, been searching for him the entire time. On February 10, 2026, Elmira Police Chief Kristen Thorne stood before reporters alongside representatives from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Chemung County District Attorney's Office, and Russell Sage College's Criminal Investigation Resource Center, an organization that had assisted with the case. Together, they announced what the DNA evidence had confirmed. Alfred Raymond Murray, Jr. was responsible for the death of Mary Theresa Simpson. Because Murray had been dead for over 2 decades by the time his name was finally spoken in connection with this case, no criminal charges would ever be filed against him. The Chemung County District Attorney's Office stated plainly that had he still been alive, murder charges would have been pursued. Instead, the only justice available to this family arrived in the form of an answer, not a trial, a name, not a verdict. In the room that day was Linda Galpin, Mary Theresa's sister. Present as the identity of the man responsible for her sister's death was spoken aloud in public for the first time in 62 years. For a family that had carried this uncertainty since 1964, it was not the ending anyone would have chosen. But after 62 years of silence, it was, finally, an ending at all. Cases like this one raise a question worth sitting with. How many other names, connected to how many other unsolved cases, are still sitting quietly in old evidence boxes across this country, waiting on a piece of technology that has not been invented yet? If you found this case as unsettling as we did, subscribe to Just Crime Talks. And if this is not the kind of channel you plan to follow, we would still ask you to carry Mary Theresa Simpson's name with you. Some cases deserve to be remembered, whether or not you come back for the next one. Thank you for watching.